When you hear the word voodoo, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it pincushion dolls that, when poked, control a human being? Or is it black magic art of raising someone from the dead? Or perhaps it makes you think of its most famous dwelling place in the United States, New Orleans. Voodoo is actually not what you think it is. Voodoo is a religion that originated in Africa that was combined with Roman Catholicism. Individuals who practice voodoo believe in a single god known as Bonje. Voodoo is primarily found in Haiti and the city of New Orleans. In my presentation, I would like to pose the question, how has voodoo shaped the culture of New Orleans today? Voodoo came to New Orleans by means of slaves in the middle of the 1700s. Their slaves were transported on giant slave ships, much like the one we see in the novel Middle Passage. Along with the slaves came their culture practices such as their religious beliefs rooted in spirit and ancestor worship. Their religion was one thing that possibly gave them hope during a terrible time. As the religious practice of voodoo began to sprout a new root in New Orleans, the culture of African religions and the Americas began to combine even more. New Orleans became a melting pot of different religions that changed since they had left Africa and Europe. The practice of making and wearing charms and amulets for protection, healing, and or ancestral prayers was a key aspect to early Louisiana voodoo. By the middle of the 1800s, voodoo became a very prominent religion in New Orleans. Voodoo queens became central figures to voodoo in the U.S. These queens presided over ceremonial meetings and ritual dances. The most popular voodoo queen of New Orleans was Marie Laveau. She conducted private rituals where she performed exorcisms and offered sacrifices to spirits using animals much like the rooster seen in this image. By the 1930s, voodoo became a tourist attraction in New Orleans. Visiting tourists would ask for favors from voodoo ritualists. Due to this overwhelming amount of fame, voodoo became an underground religion in New Orleans. Practitioners began charging money for their work, as true voodoo followers never did. Voodoo became so popular around New Orleans that in 1932 it hit the big screen. Hollywood released the movie White Zombie. This movie developed the misconception that the principal elements of voodoo are hexing and sticking pins into dolls. Thanks to Hollywood, a religion that had been rooted in early African culture became a practice that people were scared to talk about. After White Zombie, voodoo seemed to be more of a superstition rather than a religion. Though this may have been the view of the rest of the world, true New Orleans voodoo followers continued to carry on their firm belief in their religion. This kept the ancestral culture strong in the city of New Orleans. This image shows a ritualistic dance that calls on their ancestors. As we read in the novel All the Saints, as well as the Coming Through Slaughter, Congo Square was a place where African Americans gathered to express their beliefs and carry on their culture. This image shows another dance ritual that involves prayers to their ancestors. Congo Square has been the witness to many dances like this and upholds the memories above its bricks. In order for the original culture of Africa to stay strong in New Orleans, voodoo followers had to carry on practices used from the ancestral practices in Africa. They used a charm called uwanga, which was a charm used to poison an enemy. This contained the poisonous roots of a madet tree brought from Africa. This image shows a voodoo uwanga packet. Today, it is estimated that about 15% of New Orleans' population practices voodoo. Since Hollywood has imaged voodoo as a satanic religion, it is becoming harder to find authentic voodoo temples. Local shops have even opened up that sell fake voodoo healing potion and other memorabilia. Though the authentic voodoo temples are few and far between, they are quite interesting to see. As you can see in this image, voodoo temples are not extravagant cathedrals, but they have an interesting layout. The paintings on the outside here are to welcome spirits of their ancestors. These spirits are much like the saints we see in Catholicism. Let's decide to journey into one of those temples. What would we see? Well, this image shows a voodoo altar. As you can see, there are not many empty spaces. Most of the bottles there are to offer drinks to the ancestor spirits. To find most of the rituals, we're going to have to journey back outside the temple. Here we see a voodoo ritual located on a bridge in New Orleans. As you can see, there is a traditional African drum called the bata. The woman in the lower corner here is painting symbols to welcome the ancestors. Also notice the race diversity. In New Orleans, we see more racially diverse religion. This shows the voodoo in New Orleans welcomes any type of culture background. There are even voodoo healing temples in New Orleans. Here you can see a cabinet full of different healing herbs and spices at the island of Salvation Botanica in New Orleans. These services are offered to anyone who decide to come off of the streets in New Orleans. To the right you can see the corner of another altar to allow the spirits to create a better healing atmosphere. As I mentioned before, voodoo can be practiced by anyone off the streets who desire to worship the voodoo god Banje. Those voodoo followers are not crazy witch doctors that might cast a spell on you. They're an everyday New Orleans citizen that just choose to worship Banje. After they worship, they go back to their normal homes with their normal families. Without voodoo, New Orleans would have less culture from Africa. By continuing on the tradition of voodoo practices, followers are keeping alive the traditional religion that was brought over from Africa. This tradition keeps a strong bond between followers of voodoo in New Orleans because they hold dear to something that their ancestors brought over during terrible times. As shown before, voodoo has struck New Orleans culturally that attracts tourists outside of the voodoo religion. New Orleans is known for its voodoo. Many tourists come to experience the culture and learn about the original religion brought over by means of slave ships. Some sites are more authentic than others. They all still ignite something that intrigues people outside of the religion. New Orleans culture is well known by its voodoo, that New Orleans even named its arena football team the New Orleans Voodoo. This shows how the religion still has an impact on the city of New Orleans. Voodoo has come a long way since it was brought over from Africa. Though the football team by no means exemplifies the religion, it exemplifies the major cultural attractions of New Orleans. Through my presentation, I answered the question, how has voodoo shaped the culture of New Orleans? By explaining the history of voodoo in New Orleans and the impact it has had on the city. I explained how voodoo creates a motive for tourists to visit New Orleans as well as the racial diversity of the religion itself. New Orleans is a place that is more culturally diverse than many other U.S. cities, and the religion of voodoo adds to that diversity. Thank you.